What's that?
You want me to take some from that side?
It's a little disconcerting, but we'll try to manage. It's not our first summer. It's my 10th. Hard to believe. Yeah.
How weird.
What?
Weird?
Here. Starting year 10 now.
No.
It's not bad, right? Should be able to hold on for a few more. Oh, we used to meet in a building doesn't even exist anymore.
When you started, where were we? I forgot.
We were over there. Really?
What about
What year was that? 1958? 1958? It's unbelievable. So, all right, let's get this show on the road. In 1958, my dad was 10 years old. That's a long time ago. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Here we go. Good to see everyone. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam Bein Yuven b'nei Yisrael Oti leolam, oti leolam, v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, lasot ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam, ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai, et ha-shamayim v'et ha'aretz v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lasod et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam uvayom hashvi shavat v'inafash shavat v'inafash v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lasot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Amen l'chaim. Okay, blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishana b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, so everyone have a sheet in front of them. There's a lot of sources today, and some I didn't bring. Most of these sources, virtually all of them, I took from a rabbi named Rabbi Mordechai Torchiner. We've mentioned him before, from Toronto. He put an idea together that I thought was really incredible. And then I want to give my own explanation at the end of what I think he's talking about and what I think is going on here. This is a very, it's interesting. Well, I don't need to get into that, but we have a very short Torah portion because, as you know, we're in a leap year, and normally the Torah portion of Bahar is connected with Bechukotai, but because we're in a leap year and we're breaking it up so that we have enough portions for all the extra months, we only have Bahar this week, and then we'll finish the book of Leviticus next week with Bechukotai and make our way to the book of Numbers. So, there is what's the word? A very nuanced reference in this week's Torah portion to the idea of walls. Whether walls are good or walls are bad. And if you think about Israel, you know, there's when I heard the rabbi who taught this, the first time I heard it, he brought the poem of Robert Frost, that good fences make good neighbors. So you could be on either side of the debate. You could say, wouldn't it be great if we all lived together? Or you could be the kind of person that if one leaf from your neighbor's tree falls in your backyard, you've got your lawyer on speed dial and you'll slap a suit on him so quick he won't know what hit him, right? So, you know, this whatever side of the coin you're on. When you think about Israel, there are good walls and bad walls. What are the good walls? Okay, so obviously there's a wall around Jerusalem. You may have heard there's a famous wall inside of Jerusalem. It's called the Western Wall, right? Familiar? So that's a good wall, right? Now the walls around Jerusalem, this is a great trivia question. Who is the first person to ever build walls around an entity that would eventually be called Jerusalem? You'll never in a million years, I don't think, get this. No? Good guess? No guesses even? Okay, so King David's an obvious one, and King David built the famous walls around Jerusalem, but it goes way back before him. I'll give you a hint. Where's Ed? I'll give you a hint. He also, in his spare time, reviewed movies.
Eber.
Not Eber, but Shem. Shem was the son of Noah, and he was the first one, according to tradition, to build some walls around Jerusalem. Now, those would eventually be destroyed. Next time walls would be around Jerusalem. If you know who King David conquered Jerusalem from, he conquered it from the Jebusites. So the Yevusi, the Jebusites, were the second people to build walls around Jerusalem. Those got knocked down when King David knocked them down. King David then built his own walls. Those walls were also destroyed eventually by the Babylonians. And then ultimately, the next person to build walls around Jerusalem was Nehemiah. When they rebuilt the second temple, those walls got knocked down by the Romans. And the next people to actually build walls all the way around, the Ottomans. The Ottomans between 1535 and 1538. The Ottomans then came and built walls, and those are the walls that are there now. So when you go to see Jerusalem, and you've never been there before, and you see for the first time the outside walls of Jerusalem, you say, these are the walls that King David built. No, those are the walls that the Muslim Turks built. Ugh. But they're roughly built on the remnants of where. Now, tradition is that when King David built his walls, and they were destroyed, some of them sunk underground. Have you ever heard the song? And those walls will be the ones that rise up in the time of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. Have you ever heard David Melech Yisrael? What's next? Chai Chai V'Kayam, which means will live forever. Well, what does that mean? He's dead. It means that when the Mashiach comes, who will be a descendant of King David, those walls that sunk will rise back up because King David's Chai V'Kayam. He's forever. That's what that means. So next time you sing that song, you actually know what you're talking about. I sing songs all the time. I have no idea what they mean. But that's one that I know. Okay. So the walls around Jerusalem seemingly are a good thing. Your first image of October 7th was the terrorists with the bulldozers knocking over the wall and breaking through. That's a wall that we'd rather not have, but we have to. The walls of Jerusalem are holy. The separation fence around the West Bank is a wall that we don't want, but we have to have it. Right? So like a good documentary would be 2 walls. Right? And you could talk about the history of the Western Wall, you talk about the history of the separation fence and so forth. So we wish we had better neighbors. We have the worst neighbors in the world. But because we have the worst neighbors in the world, we have these fences. So there are good walls and there are bad walls. Okay? Clear so far? All right. Now, I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking Torah. So let's look now at the beginning of Bahar, which is Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. Anyone have the page in Plout? 25:1? 946. Page 946. Or if you have the Saperstein, page 318. Okay. Judy, would you be the honorary Einsbruck?
It would be my honor. Thank you.
Okay, here we go.
The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather the yield. But in the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all of its yield. You shall count off 7 weeks of years.
Okay, so good enough. So what just happened? So we're learning about what's called Shemitah. Anyone know what Shemitah is? Anyone not? This group, anyone not know what Shemitah? Shemitah is the 7th year where you let the land grow fallow. Okay, so, yeah, sure. It's a whole different class. I have that class, but it's right. I know. Okay, so there's nothing in the Torah that the Torah is not. What's the word? Chronological. And mukdam and muchar b'Torah. Right? It's not chronological. So the Rashi explains here the answer to your question. Why are we back at Mount Sinai? Because they're making the point here in the Torah later on. We're learning about the idea of Shemitah. Shemitah is the idea of, now, Shemitah is agricultural laws that you don't need to know for 40 years. In fact, you people never need to know them because you're all going to die in the wilderness. But I'm telling it to you now, because with Shemitah comes a lot of other ancillary laws that aren't in the Torah. And so the point here that Rashi makes is, everything that you ever learned or will need was taught at Mount Sinai. And so this whole section is here later on in the Torah to teach you that not only are the mitzvahs in the Torah were they taught at Mount Sinai, but all of the different principles and all the different things that go along with Shemitah that are in the Talmud that aren't in the Torah were also taught at Mount Sinai, which means to say, this is the argument in the Torah to make the point that everything in the Talmud wasn't just written down 2,000 years later. It was taught at Mount Sinai in an oral form and then ultimately written down later on. So that's the main point. Now, let's look at what happens. First of all, these are laws that don't exist for these people in the wilderness. The Shemitah year, all these agricultural laws only pertain to the land of Israel. Okay, so On the seventh, verse 4, on the seventh year, you're going to have a complete rest. Okay, fine. But now, we have the question. Stuff that was planted in the sixth year could still be growing in the seventh year. You're not allowed to plant in the seventh year, but can you eat the stuff that you planted in the sixth year that grows over into the seventh year? You understand the question? Oh. Okay, so look at verse 5. The aftergrowth of this harvest, you can't reap it, which means you can't put it into bags and go sell it at the market, but, and you can't make any money off of it, and you can eat it if you want, but you also have to make holes in your fences so that anyone who wants can come and eat it. And that includes everyone who works for you, all your animals, and so forth. Essentially, this is a principle called hefker. Now, it's explained in the Talmud. Hefker means it's abandoned. Anyone who wants it can go and eat it. So if I walk into your field on year 1 through 6, you can call the police. I can go to the corners. You leave the corners of your fields. But if I break, if they had corners of the fields that you had to leave for the poor. And the point of the corner was you couldn't see them there. So they wouldn't be embarrassed. Why? Because they put fences around. During the seventh year, people were allowed to cross that fence and come into your land because that's hefker, that's now abandoned, and anyone can come and take that food. Which means that the fences were there had to be taken down. Which means that sometimes those walls are good and sometimes they're not. Clear so far? Okay, so now if you look on the sheet, a midrash. The first midrash on the sheet is from the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, and he says this. And on the now, by the way, this stuff that we're learning about Shemitah, we already learned in the book of Exodus, but we're learning some new points here. But he's commenting here on what it says in Exodus 23. And on the seventh, meaning the Shemitah year, you shall release it and abandon it. Why did the Torah say this, if not for paupers to eat it? In other words, why did we say anyone can have it? Because now poor people aren't relegated to the corners. They can go in and get the good stuff. I will bring the produce and distribute it to the needy. Therefore, the verse says, and on the seventh you shall release it and abandon it. This tells us, look what it says here, this tells us to break holes in the fences, but the sages fenced it in to improve the world. Now, you know what improve the world is in Hebrew? I have the board of the URJ here. It's a joke. Yes, tikkun olam. That's all they know. Now, what does it mean here? Tikkun olam here means, well, let's look at the Rambam, and then hopefully it'll become clear. So Maimonides says this. There's a commandment to release all that the land produces in the seventh year, as it says, and on the seventh year you shall release it and abandon it. Anyone who locks his vineyard or fences his field in the seventh cancels a commandment. The same is true if one gathers all of the produce into his home. So if you say in the sixth year, all this land, all this fruit, I can have it too. So I'm going to take it all and put it in my house. You can't do that. You can go out and eat some of it, but the goal is that you have to leave it there so that anyone could have it. And the idea is that you're allowed to keep your fence up, but you have to make some holes in it so that needy can get through and take the food if they want. Can you pass a mic to you? Can you pass this back?
In the Midrash, it says, I will bring in the produce and distribute it. So it's okay to harvest in the seventh year as long as you distribute it to the poor? Because doesn't that work?
So,
shouldn't you just leave it there and let them come take it to eat?
No, okay, so what it's saying is, ultimately, you might think that I'm supposed to gather it and give it to the needy. And that means that you don't want them on your property. Say, okay, I'll gather it, but then I'll go out to the poor and I'll give it, but I don't want them I'm not breaking any holes in my fences. So the rabbis came and said, no. Tikkun olam means you've got to make holes in your fences, let them come on your property. That's good point. Okay, and Maimonides basically says the same thing. Okay, so now we see that fences are a problem, right? And the reality is that we wish we didn't have these fences, but for certain reasons we have to, because otherwise people would just be, it would be a mess. It would be a mess. Now, you know that there are certain rules in Jewish law that differentiate between if you lived in a walled city or if you didn't live in a walled city. For example, has anyone ever heard of Shushan Purim? Right. So Shushan was a walled city, and so what they said is they observed Purim on a different day because. So if you live in a walled city, now what's a walled city? A walled city is any city that was walled at the time of Joshua. So if you walled it after Joshua, then it's not considered a walled city. So, like if you live in Boca and you're in a what do they call that? A gated community, it doesn't count. It doesn't count. So if there's a gated community, but you live outside the gated community, and a golf ball falls on your lanai, can you keep it? So if you've ever been to like a community, board, an HOA board in Boca, that's what they talk about. That's how. And then they say, well, who wants to be on the committee to deal with the tree on 12th? So if you're retired and you move to Boca, that's what you can do with your time. Okay, now the Torah mentions something about a walled city that's unusual. So if you look now, this is in Bahar, but in order that you wouldn't have to flip to another page, I just brought the verses here. So if you look at Leviticus 25, verses 23 verses, 29, 30, and 31, it says this. Ken, would you mind reading those verses? And
when one sells a house of dwelling in a walled city, its redemption shall be until the end of the year of its sale, for a year shall be its redemption. And if it is not redeemed until a complete year has fully passed, the house in the walled city will stand permanently for the one who purchased it, for his generations. It shall not revert in Yovel. And the houses of the villages which have no wall around them shall be considered as fields of the land. It may be redeemed, and in Yovel it will revert.
Okay. Okay, so the Yovel, so there's 2 years. There's 2 types of years. There's the Shemitah year, which is every 7th year, and all slaves go free, and you let the land go fallow. And then there's the Yovel year, which is every 50 years. In the Yovel year, all slaves also go free, but something else happens. All land that's been sold reverts back to its original owner. So if one guy buys up everybody's land, and now there's one person who owns basically everything, there's a mechanism in the Torah to keep anyone from becoming a landlord for too long. So in the 50th year, you have to sell the land back. By the way, I was teaching this to one of my students, one of my high school students this week. And I told him, this is what happened in the early 1900s in Israel, in Palestine. Because the Jews, the JNF, the Rothschilds, and everything, they were looking to buy up land in Israel, in Palestine. So you know what you do when you want to buy land? You look for who owns it. So you find the guy who owns it and says, you own this land? We'd like to buy it. He says, all right, $5 million. It's worth maybe $250,000, but $5 million. Jews say, no one else in the world would take a look at it. It's the most disgusting, swamp-infested place in the world. Jews say, we'll take it. We'll take it, whatever the price is. Here's $5 million. So that guy now takes his money, moves to Cairo, buys a beautiful condo on the Nile. The locusts, the hail, come right into his house. I mean, he's got such a great view. This is an Exodus joke. But all of his tenants who now live there just lost their house to Zionists. And they've got to leave. That happened in some places. And those people, they didn't like Jews after that. But the good news is they didn't care for him before that either. So you don't feel. Yeah. But in some, that's not what happened all over the land. But that did happen in some places because they would go to the landlord who owned everything. Because if you want to buy it, you go to the person who owns it. He bought it, and they had to leave. And that happened in some places.
It's a good thing that the Jubilee year didn't apply to the cave of Machpelah. Machpelah cave.
Yeah.
Otherwise, have to be given back.
Yeah, that's true. That was a long time ago. No, but non-Jews can't inherit the land, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, what we're saying here is, let's say the 50th year comes about, and you bought land. So let me read it. And one who sells a house of a dwelling in a walled city. So say you bought land inside Jerusalem, inside the walls. Its redemption shall be till the end of the year of its sale. So if I want to buy back land that I sold inside the walled city of Jerusalem, I have a year to buy it back from the person that I sold it to. Why? Because the Torah says so. But after a year, I lose it forever, and when the 50th year comes, I lose it. It's not coming back to me. That's the rule inside a walled city. Okay? Now, and the houses of villages which have no wall around them shall be considered as field of the land. It may be redeemed, and in the Yovel it will revert. So all we're saying here is, the Yovel year works. Any land that you sell in 50 years, you get it back, except in the case of, in a walled city, you lose it. Which means to say that if you buy land or sell land in a walled city, it's not worth as much. It's not as good a deal. It's better to have land outside of a walled city. And the reason is because God wanted us to settle the land. And he didn't want all of us to live in Brickell. He wanted us to go out and settle the land. And the reason why is because the agriculture of the land and the mitzvahs of the land are tied to worshiping God. And if we're not out there filling up the whole land, and by the way, Israel's not that good at it. All the good jobs are in what's called the Merkaz, the center of the land. And if you go up to the Golan and you go down to the Negev, we're working really hard with JNF and some other people to try to fill up, live in the desert. Israelis have never heard of Phoenix. They don't think it can work. Nobody wants to live in the Negev, except for a few farmers. We're trying to convince them, look at Phoenix. You could have it. There are a couple crazy people who live in Eilat, but it's mostly tourists. Okay. Eilat also is 5,000 degrees. But the Negev, Negev's no hotter than it is here. But that's why you all leave in the summer. All right. A source from the Talmud, Bavli Erechin 33b, from the Babylonian Talmud. A house or dwelling in a walled city. It was walled and then settled, not where it was settled and then walled. Just a little bit of a distinction. Because sometimes you did go to settle the land, and you did move out there, but there were really dangerous people out there, so you had to put a wall around to protect yourself. That's okay. You can still revert back your land. Okay, but if if it's something else, then it doesn't work. Okay, now a little bit of an explanation on this. The 19th century Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, gave a little bit of an explanation. Annabella, would you mind reading Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch? This is his explanation on Leviticus 25:34.
For clearly these laws establish the greatest possible upkeep of an urban population occupied with agriculture as the predominant fundamental characteristic type of the nation. It places an obstacle to the growth of large cities at the expense of the surrounding country, which otherwise is so very prevalent.
Right, so by the way, you remember what was the sin of the Tower of Babel? Was that they all wanted to live together and they didn't go out and settle the land. They all wanted to live in one place. And so God said, your punishment is going to be, not only am I going to knock the tower down, but I'm going to spread you all over the world. And you're going to have to speak different languages as you go to different places. But really, they were spread all over the world. That was because you would think, the Torah says, in that day, everyone was united. That sounds great. Well, God said, that's fine that you're united, but I want you to be settling the land, and they didn't do that, and God was upset. So you can see Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch saying here, clearly what's better is to go out and live the land, and farm the land, and be on the land, and so forth, and make the land grow, and that's better than urban sprawl, so far. Okay, Annabelle, let's... By the way,
that the houses in the country towns were protected, like the land itself, from permanent sale, and in Yovel reverted to the original owners or their heirs. Provision was made that, on the whole, town and land remained in connection as family property, so that, as a rule, every field and every vineyard would have as its proprietor a householder in the neighboring town. Only walled cities were detached from the land. In them, house property could be transferred permanently to other owners. There, a population could develop which was unconnected with agricultural work and had to find their means of living by trade and industry. But as this character was limited to just cities which had been walled in and separated from the land already before its inhabitants had settled in it, and moreover, only if they had been already walled off from the land from the time of Joshua. A city line cutting itself off and being cut off from agriculture was altogether rigidly limited to a fixed number of points in the land.
Right, so you had to have some urban centers, fine, and specifically Jerusalem, because Jerusalem had a different industry. The industry of Jerusalem was the sacrificial cult, right? And so you had people living there, the priests and the Levites, whose job it was to do religion and the upkeep of religion and the maintenance of religion. And okay, so fine. And you may have that in other places too, because in other places you're going to have military garrisons. And okay, fine, so you need to do that. But for the most part, the Torah wanted Jews to be farming the land and being connected with the land. And if you're going to tell, and these laws only mattered to, only spoke with respect to the land of Israel. So if you're going to tell us that the land, here's something that's really interesting. If you follow what's going on college campuses, the absolute disgrace that's happening, on all these different campuses. When something during apartheid, I doubt that South African students on college campuses were trolled and had swastikas drawn on their doors, or whatever, or the war in Syria that's going on. During the Civil War, they killed 500,000 of their own people. I don't think Syrian students have to walk around campus and worry that anyone's going to worry them. During the Rwandan genocide, I don't think the Rwandan population at Harvard had to worry that people are going to say, "You're Rwandan?" But for the Jewish people, because of what's going on in Israel, the very fact that you're Jewish, even if you've never even been there, you're connected to it. Never in the history of the world has there been a people so connected to a land. Because our religion is based on the land. No one else has that. No one else even understands that. And so part of the reason that Jews are chased wherever they are is because part and parcel of being Jewish is the land. No one else has that. So if you're wondering whose land it is, it's a different argument.
This is in Torah, it talks about the land, and this holds at that point.
I'll repeat the question.
In all the many years thereafter, the civil occupants, was this all rules also continued? Was this the same thing after? Was this the same kind of beliefs when the Romans were there, and then the Ottomans? Is this the argument that the Palestinians say, we have owned this land all of this time before? It was our, it was never redeemed before, and we've kept it because it's still in here because this is the law of the land, and we were outside the walled cities at that point.
No. So, well, listen. Any argument that the Palestinians make is fiction. There's no such thing as a Palestinian argument that makes sense. Begin with that premise. I mean, everything that they say, if you listen to them, is utter nonsense. One of the great things is, so you ask them, well, the Palestinians go all the way back to the Philistines, right? And the Philistines were there already in the 13th century BCE. So you say, okay, well, what's the connection between the Palestinians and the Philistines? The Philistines don't exist anymore. There's no such thing. Walk around Harvard and look for a Hittite or a Jebusite or any Canaanite. And they don't exist. The only people from back then who still exist are called Jews. And the reason we're called Jews is because we're from Judea. Because that area was settled and given to the Jews. Before that, there were Canaanites there, no question. But none of those Canaanites still exist. And the Canaanites lost the land because of their sins. There's a line in Genesis that says, that God says to Abraham, you can't conquer the land yet. You can't take the land for your people because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Well, what does that mean? It means that the land is given and inhabited by certain people. But if you sin, you get kicked out. Well, when you reach your threshold of sins, you get kicked out. So that's what happened to the Amorites. Eventually, their iniquity ran out. Amorites is another word for Canaanites, and they got kicked out. So the Jews moved in. Well, what happened? We sinned too. We got kicked out also. So then we went back. We sinned again. We got kicked out again. Then we paid for it dearly, and then we went back.
Was Amalek not in Canaan? Because there are descendants of Amalek.
Well, no, we don't know. Because what happened was, so we have a mitzvah to kill the Amalekites. But, what happened was, no, unfortunately. But Sennacherib in 723, when he conquered the northern kingdom, he did what Stalin did. He mixed everyone up so that they wouldn't have loyalty. And at that point, the Amalekites got mixed up with all the other people. And so there's no way since then of knowing who's an Amalekite. But as a nation, they ceased to exist when the Assyrians conquered that region. So it's a good point. All right, let's go on because we're running out of time. I got a lot more to get to. At the end of the Torah, towards the end of the Torah, in Ki Tavo, we get to the second of two lists of tochachot, the punishments that the Jewish people will suffer if they don't follow the mitzvahs. And one of them is this. Look what it says, Deuteronomy 28, verse 52. And he will besiege you at all of your gates, he meaning one of your enemies, until the collapse of your tall and reinforced walls, in which you trust all through your land. Which means to say, you Jews, you can wall in every city you got. But if you don't follow the mitzvahs, I'm going to allow your enemies to come and breach the walls. And by the way, we have a couple of different fast days, right? The 17th of Tammuz, the 10th of Tevet. These are the different days that the Babylonians and the Romans breached the outer walls of Jerusalem. The walls of Jerusalem were pretty thick. But they were breached because the Jews sinned and God allowed. And so what he's saying is you can put up all the walls you want. But your enemies are still going to be able to destroy you. Or you could put up no walls and do all the mitzvahs, and then no one's going to be able to touch you. So whether or not you're safe depends on whether I'm protecting you or not. That's what's implied in Deuteronomy 28. Okay, now the Midrash on that, the Tanchuma. How will you determine your strength? Are they in open camps or in fortresses? If they live in open camps, they are mighty, and they rely upon their strength. If they're in fortresses, they're weak and of soft heart. Right? Because if you feel like you need the walls, it's probably because you're not doing the mitzvahs. Now, Jerusalem's different. Jerusalem's different. And if you look through Zechariah, the prophets, they say, Jerusalem's surrounded by a ring of fire because inside of Jerusalem, you have holy confines. And you need to mark off the holy confines. So, for example, when you ate of a sacrifice, you had to eat it within the walls of Jerusalem. And if you went beyond the walls of Jerusalem, then it becomes a sin. Well, how do you know what are the confines of Jerusalem? So for lots of different legal reasons, you needed certain walls around Jerusalem. Jerusalem's different. But in the rest of the places, if you need walls, it's because you're not relying on God. Right? I think this is like psychological talk, right? We put up walls. Right? Have you ever heard that? Okay. Now, when the Jews first came into the land of Israel, after Moses died, they were led by Joshua. And the first thing they did is they went to Jericho. And they blew a shofar, and what happened?
Walls came down.
You've heard the song? Yeah. The walls came tumbling down. So here are all these people who said, nobody's going to attack us, we got walls. Joshua said, cue the music. And that was it. The walls came tumbling down. So what's the symbolism there? Why is that the way the war began? Because one of the things God's telling Jewish people is you don't need walls. Walls are no good. Now, Jerusalem's different, but this is Jericho. This is like an interesting idea. So far what we've detailed throughout the Torah is a variety of reasons where walls are bad. Walls are bad because needy can't get in to eat what they need to eat. You're keeping people out. Walls are bad because it shows you don't trust in God. Walls are bad because they disconnect you from the land, and I want you to be focusing on the land. Walls are bad because you lose your ability to sell your land after the first year. It doesn't revert back in the 50th year. So far, what we've showed is that walls are problematic throughout the Torah, other than Jerusalem. Eileen? Can you pass the mic?
But you can still trust in God and still need the wall. I'm thinking about the Gaza Strip in Israel.
Okay. So, just because walls are bad, sometimes you need them.
Even when you trust in God.
Yeah, sometimes you need them. Now, here's what I would tell you, though. In the times of King David, if there were a people living within your borders, living in Gaza, living in the West Bank, and they continued to come and blow your stuff up, King David would not have been afraid of the International Court of Justice. King David wouldn't have been afraid of the anti-Semitic United Nations. He would have rolled in there and said, I'm going to destroy you all. But Israel can't do that. So they have to put up a wall. Because we live in different times, and we don't have Jewish sovereignty in a temple period. So part of the land of Israel today, part of the difference between the state of Israel and the land of Israel, or the state of Israel, and some people call the state of Israel the third commonwealth. First commonwealth was the first temple, the second commonwealth was the second temple, the third commonwealth is Medinat Yisrael. However, during the first temple period and the second temple period, those were theocracies. Those were ruled by Torah law. If you accept the mitzvahs, if you accept the laws of Noah, and you live peacefully within our borders, then fine. But if you cause trouble, we're going to kick you out. You can't do that anymore. Israel's a democracy. King David wouldn't have known what a democracy was. He lived in a theocracy. Now, if you wonder, should we go back to a theocracy? Yeah, I mean, I would say that anyone who is advocating for a theocracy in Israel today tends to be wrong on everything. Right? You know, I mean, you see like reservists dying in Israel every day. But they just did a study that said if all of the Orthodox were drafted, we wouldn't need reserves anymore. We would have enough soldiers at all times if they would just go to the army, that once you turned, 22, 23, you didn't have to go back to war every 6 months because they had enough soldiers to rotate in and out. Those are the people who want the theocracy. So they're not always right either. And we could point out a number of other reasons where they're, drastically off base. Richard?
I have an image from biblical literature of we shall all return to Jerusalem by way of Jericho. And I'm wondering if it is what you just mentioned about Joshua, blowing the shofar and the walls fall down. But is there something else?
No, I think that's the idea. I think, it's just we're a very tough neighborhood. so look, after the Second Intifada, the only reason the Second Intifada ended was because they built the wall around the West Bank, and they couldn't get through to blow stuff up anymore. So, now people drive around that wall and say it's an open-air prison and all this nonsense, which is not true. I mean, it's just not, it's not factual. But it did stop the carnage. So if you're going to say, well, Rabbi, you just told us walls are bad, shouldn't we take that wall down? Like, what are you, nuts? No. Sometimes you have to have them. But it's unfortunate. I remember the days when I was living in Israel, in the 90s, during the Oslo period, and we would go to the West Bank for lunch and have a nice day. And we walked freely. Now, if you went there, you'd be lynched.
From a perspective of commerce, I buy your land. You have a year to revert back and buy it back.
In walled cities.
In walled cities. Where commerce is, where it's more, thank you. Where it's more of a commercial rather than an agrarian society. What can I do with the land for a year knowing that there is a risk that you're going to buy it back? I think, you think about the concept, it really chills the ability to dispose of your property.
Right. I mean, your hope is that the person's not going to want to buy back.
Or
maybe,
can't, whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. But I think it's meant to deter. The whole idea in Torah is you should never be selling your land. The only reason you would ever sell your land is because you're broke. Now,
The counter to that argument would be, a person might wait for a year for the redemption, but then know whatever investment they do within the walled city is for their benefit, their lineage benefit, without
right.
48 years or 45 years or 5 years from now reverting back to the owner.
Right. Very good. Okay, let me try to bring this to a close and see if we can make this make sense. But first, let me just point out this. I had some, Steve Jobs, you can read the story if you want. I got it from Rabbi Torchiner, but who got it from the internet. He created these workspaces where everyone was working together. So nobody had private offices, everyone's just in one big room, because what he saw was the certain people who did this job were over here, and certain people who did this job were over here, and certain people who did this job were over there, and they never talked to each other. And so you only got ideas from the people you worked with, but you didn't get ideas from and so you work together and things start working out better. And it's an example of if you knock down walls, okay. This is like the idea of propinquity. It was studied at Harvard. Okay, so they studied at Harvard. They said everyone get together, and when the Jews walk by, scream at them. That's what they learned. Okay. All right. Look what Maimonides says, the second to last source. And these are the essential elements of construction of the house. The house means the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. We make a kadosh and a kadosh kadoshim in it. I mean, we make a holy area and then the Holy of Holies inside of that. And there should be a space before the kodesh called the ulam. Ulam means like a studio or a hall, right, in modern Hebrew. The three of them are called heichal. Heichal also means an area. And they make another divider around the heichal, distant, like the hangings of the yards in the wilderness. Anything surrounded by this divider, which is like the yard of the Ohel Moed, is called Azara. The entire area is called Mikdash. So what he's saying is, Jerusalem is divided up by more walls than you could ever imagine. But the reason is because certain people were only allowed to go here. If you're not a Kohen, you could only go here. If you were a Levite, you could go here. If you had this animal, you go there. If you're Tameh, you go here. The women go here. The kings go there. But there are lots of rules that when you're worshiping God in the Holy Temple, you have to follow the rules. But that's only Jerusalem. So yes, it's true, you need walls in Jerusalem, but those walls are holy, and the Jews come in together. So I want to tell you a story that's mentioned at least 4 times in the Talmud. And that's not that common, that you have a story that's mentioned this frequently. But it's mentioned many times in the Talmud, so many times that we should probably know it. And the story goes like this. You know, the Hasmoneans were not very good. The original Maccabees were great, but their descendants were not good. They worshipped idols, they fought with each other, and they led ultimately, you know, you think about 150 years before zero, maybe 200 years before zero, when the Hanukkah story happens. And by the time you get to zero, the Romans are there, and King Herod is in charge, and 70 years later, the temple's destroyed. So the Maccabees are sort of the last rulers the last Jewish rulers who lead to the downfall. They do a horrible job of ruling, and they're corrupt. And ultimately, the Romans come and take them over and lose it, and the temple's destroyed. But there's a story that's mentioned multiple times in the Talmud. It's mentioned in Bava Kama, it's mentioned in Menachot, it's mentioned in Sota, over and over. And the story is like this. There were 2 brothers who were from the Hasmonean line, and they had a civil war of who was going to be in control. One's name was Aristobulus, and one's name was Hyrcanus. Now, according to most of the places in the Talmud, it says that Aristobulus was based inside the walls of Jerusalem, and Hyrcanus was based outside the walls of Jerusalem, but there's one place that has it reversed. But the majority says that it was Aristobulus on the inside and Hyrcanus on the outside, and he had his group, and Aristobulus had his group. And Aristobulus was guarding the inside of Jerusalem, and they weren't able to get at each other because of the walls, but they were in essentially a Cold War, because they couldn't get at each other, but they wanted to. But they both recognized that a daily sacrifice needed to be brought every day in the temple. The problem is that the people inside had the treasury, had all the money, and the people on the outside had access to the animals. So they made a deal. Every day, the Jews inside, led by Aristobulus, they took a bucket and they put money in it, dinarim, and they put it over the wall, and the people on the outside would get a little animal and put it in. And they schlepped the animal up and over, and then they went and offered it, because both sides recognized that it was a terrible shanda not to offer a daily sacrifice. And this is what they did every day. They hated each other, but they had this system, and that made it work. Clear so far?
Yep.
So one day, a Jew on the outside came to Hyrcanus and said, as long as you keep doing this, and the daily sacrifice is all offered, you're never going to be able to defeat them. Because God will always protect them inside as long as they offer the daily sacrifice. So you know what you should do? Tomorrow when they send the money over, you take the money and put inside a pig. Which is like the most offensive, horrible thing you could do. So they did it. Again, this story multiple times in the Talmud. As the pig was going up and coming back down, the pig took its nails and put them into the walls. And at that moment, they said there was an earthquake in the whole land of Israel. The whole land of Israel shook. It was such a big deal. And Rashi comes and explains that this happened in the days of Titus. Now, Titus isn't going to be around for another couple hundred years. Titus is the Roman who destroyed Jerusalem. You can go to Rome and see the Arch of Titus that has the picture of, the destruction and the Roman soldiers carrying out all the stuff. So you can go to Rome and spin on it. That's what I did. I told you that story, right? My wife was screaming at me. She said, don't do it. Don't do it. I said, this is the only reason I came to Italy, is to spit on this thing. What do you mean? So I said, look. But that's the tradition. I mean, this thing was built to celebrate the destruction of the Jewish people. Okay, anyway, I have a picture of it. I have a great picture of it. Because my son was into it. My wife, not so much. So, why does Rashi say Titus is not going to live for another 200 years? So, what it shows is the Romans were the ones who came to Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem. And it was in those days that the Roman legions started coming to Israel. Why? Because they didn't want civil war, because they didn't want the war to spread. So they came to quell the civil war. And it was the civil war between the Jews in the time of the Greeks that ultimately led the Romans to come to Jerusalem and destroy Jerusalem. In other words, there's a civil war of the Jews fighting in Jerusalem on opposite sides of a wall that led to the destruction of all of them. Now, this is a true story. The Israelis in Gaza have found proof through all the computers and stuff that they've stolen and all the records that they've stolen. And it's conclusive that the reason October 7th happened when it happened was because the Hamas knew that Israel was weak because of the judicial reform debate. And it was for that reason they attacked, because they saw Israel fighting with each other. It's the same story. It's the same story 2,000 years later. And so here's what I would tell you. The walls of Jerusalem are holy. And what Maimonides says here about they had this wall in the Holy Temple, and this wall in the Holy Temple, and this wall in the Holy Temple, those walls are holy. And when Zechariah says there's a ring of fire around Jerusalem, that ring of fire wall is holy. But other walls, for the most part, are not. And Joshua knocked them down as soon as he showed up. And so the answer is, there are some times, if you think about walls, that they incorporate holiness. The two most obvious examples are the sukkah and the chuppah. Right? Those are two wall. I mean, chuppah doesn't have actual walls, it has a roof, but because of the posters, I mean, it's meant to be a specific space underneath a roof. So there are times, like a sukkah has to have a certain amount of walls. That's the halakha. Well, what's the difference between a sukkah, a chuppah, Jerusalem, and other walls? If the wall is meant to bring Jews together for the purpose of holiness, it's good. If the wall is meant to separate Jews, poor Jews and rich Jews, Jews over here, whatever, it's not good. And when we create walls like Aristobulus and Hyrcanus used the wall of Jerusalem to fight each other, it led to their downfall. But when we create walls around Jerusalem that are meant to bring Jews together for the purpose of doing holy stuff, in that case, then walls are good. But if we continue to build up, whether it's an actual wall or real walls, like the idiotic judicial reform and these other things, then our enemies sense our weakness. And because God lets his defenses down, we're at our most vulnerable. And unfortunately, we're living through that right now. So the antidote to October 7th is to build a wall that includes all of the Jews in acts of holiness, and then nobody can destroy us. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Okay. Chinam.
Chinam.
Right.
Going to, over the holiday.
Baseless. In modern Hebrew, it means free. Like it's free.
And based on this, I'm inviting Amei Haaretz to have dinner with me tonight.
Nice.
So I was
Yes, you're cool.
motivated for going early to write.
For the sake of heaven, arguments that are really valid. Arguments that
It'll be,
what is the what is that one? What is the Hebrew? Where if we're arguing
Yeah, it's called Lashem Shemayim.
Lashem Shema,
Right, for the sake of heaven.
for the sake of heaven.
Right.
Arguments for the sake
Lashem Shemayim.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Nice. Shabbat Shalom. Yeah, yeah. Good. Yeah, it's a phrase, yeah.
Okay, so but necessary between Gaza Strip and Israel, but it's necessary in our southern situation.
we're about to be expendable. How do you answer that question? Wise up. Create space where
And then we've got to follow them. So if people are coming across the border against those laws,
not even peacefully. I don't think it matters.
there's something. I don't know, it's weird. It's like a,
I asked
but I'm not an expert.
struggling with that, struggling
That's fine. That's fine.
and that's what these are. This is all about me. And you. It's Hashem Shema. Those are
This is talking about what would you do if you had a theocracy
That's the lesson. So this is the
Hi, how are you? Oh, okay. Oh, he's the best. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. He's going to Syracuse. Where are you from? Okay. Are you Stacy's parents? Yes. Oh, okay, great. Oh, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you're here. October 7th. No, because people don't even fast on Yom HaShoah. So if you don't fast on Yom HaShoah, what else? What's worse than that? I mean, Yom HaShoah. lot of farmland, and you see right away a sign that say, "Come from the Shnukah." Here we're observing Shnukah. No, I think pretty much all parts do. And we're doing it. They follow all the rules. You look at the Dome of the Rock, well, what's it look on top of? What's that like? What was it? And what the British Union did, they gave it to the UN. And what the UN did, they partitioned it and said all that area is Jewish. So okay, so you have the UN, the world state, all this area is Jewish. And the big parts, and the majority of it is Arab. And so the Jews said, fine with this. The Arabs said, not only will we not take it, but 3 years after the Holocaust, we're coming to kill the rest of the Jews. So yeah, you lost some villages when you tried to do another Holocaust. Okay, sorry. Did you know in 1950, Abraham Brady, who was the head of FATA, before one of the deal. In 1950, when he declared FATA, he did it from Amman. And he was against the majority, and he said, we don't want the West Bank. Because the West Bank belongs to Jordan. And if we would have said we wanted Jordan, the king of Jordan would have killed us. So we don't want the West Bank. The West Bank is never ours. We just want the parts that the Jews said. That was the original statement for Palestine. Well, the parts that the Jews found, which the boxes and things like that, which previously no one had ever did. So what they were saying is, we don't want the West Bank. We only want the areas that the Jews found. Because the arguments aren't on this side. That's my
We have friends in strange places.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for your time. Whatever you like. Good to see you. It's in here. Where the meeting starts at 10:30. All right. Shabbat shalom.
That's a low here.
You were just there? When? Last week?
Yes. We went to the
The Fains are good bands. Richard and Colleen Fain. You have to go to Japan and find people who don't hate the Jews.
A lot of Asian law.
Yeah, they don't like
They love Israel.
because they never had Christianity or Islam.
And also because this is the Christian here.
Oh,
but they're sitting in the city.
But in general, they, you're not Christian.
This is in the Protestant temple. Anihu Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh.
That's a Protestant temple. With all that the evangelical.
Only evangelical read this, you'll see what it is. This guy is a Protestant minister. He's a Yakar Yerushalayim. He has a chair in Bible in the Hebrew University named after him.
He's the only one in Japan that's like this?
He was in Manchuria in 1938 when God talked to him, came into it, and he had a vision, and he said, pray for the reconstitution of a Jewish state, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and pray for the coming of the Messiah. And he's got gifts there from all the residents of Israel ever.
Does he have a power? Looks like a church in shul in Detroit or something.
It is absolute. This is a group of Israelis, and behind them, some of his congregants.